On the table in front of me are 13 of the most ambitious prints I've attempted with my Prusa XL. I'm talking 5 materials and 5 tool heads combining to create some of the most unique objects I've ever seen. Combinations of rigid and flexible, soluble and not. All sorts of weird and wonderful and wacky creations that were enabled by the Prusa XL. The way we're going to structure this is from least ambitious all the way up to most ambitious. I'm going to go through these prints one by one, tell you what worked, what didn't, and what I learned along the way. Adding colors as we go along, adding different materials as we go along, and hopefully trending in the direction of better quality as well. So you do have to stay around to the end if you want to see just what this machine can do. And trust me, it is quite remarkable. But it is not without its pitfalls. Certainly in the early days of owning the Prusa XL, there were a lot of issues. I've documented those in a few of my prior videos. If you haven't seen those, make sure to check the description down below. Those issues plagued many of my initial prints. So as we go along through certainly this first row, you'll see some of the issues that the early adopters were experiencing with their Prusa XLs. My name's Taylor, and this is YGK3D. If you find value in today's video, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to my channel. All right, without further ado, let's get into our very first print. The humble 3D Benchy. I don't care if it's 2030 and your 3D printer is cooking you dinner. If you're not starting by printing one of these, you're doing something wrong. Not remarkable by any means, but it is impressive in the fact that it is of equal quality, I would say, to something you would see on the Prusa Mark IV, Bambu Lab X1 Carbon, any modern 3D printer for that matter. This, however, was printed with a 0.6mm nozzle. This is the trend across all of these prints. They were all printed with 0.6mm nozzles. Prusa has since changed from 0.6 default to 0.4, which frankly I'm a little bit salty about because I paid a lot for this printer and then I had to pay more to get different nozzles, which they're now recommending. So we have a good baseline. From there, we can build and start adding in some of the layers of complexity that were afforded because of the advanced capabilities of a tool changer. So next up, we have a dual color Benchy. Again, this is a pretty standard print that really any printer could accomplish that has multicolor capabilities. But the important distinction is how long this took and how much waste it generated. This required just over an hour to print, compared to over 5 hours for the same print on, say, the Bambu Lab X1 Carbon with an AMS. It also generated a heck of a lot less waste. Only a few grams of waste material went onto the prime tower versus a whole lot more in purge because you are using a single nozzle on the Bambu Lab printers. So we already have a leg up for simple multicolor prints on the Prusa XL. Now I will note that the quality of this print is not superb. This is one of those issues I mentioned for the early adopters. Stringing was a very big issue in the early days of owning the Prusa XL. Since then, there have been a variety of features implemented at the firmware level and at the slicer level to mitigate some of this stringing. Also, just dropping print temperatures across the board seemed to help considerably. Next up, we have a dual color sheep. At face value, this doesn't look any more complex than the dual color Benchy that we just had a look at. But what you don't see here is the PETG support that I used under the chin of the sheet. So this is our first example of using 2 different materials in the same print. We use PETG with a 0 gap interface to mimic soluble support without the expense of soluble filament. So we are able to get a very clean underside of that surface by using 2 materials that don't stick together very well. PETG with PLA or PLA with PETG is a very popular combination and is the reason a lot of people are interested in the XL. In this instance, it did work quite well. But as we go along, you'll see that it is not bulletproof and it is not a one-size-fits-all solution for support material. You'll also observe a fair amount of banding on the surface of this print. This is what led me down the rabbit hole of trying to solve Z banding on the Prusa XL. I dedicated an entire video to the topic where I presented my solution, which did solve my issue in the short term. I came up with the bump block method, which required that the tool force itself into the side of the gantry and hit a little printed piece in order to correct the alignment of the tool before returning to the print between tool changes. The result was perfectly stacked layers. I used this solution for a while, but then I started to slowly phase it out. it seemed less and less necessary to use the bump solution in order to get good looking layers. It seems to me that perhaps there's some sort of break-in period after which the tool changing mechanism works more reliably. To short track this process, you could instead just grease the couplers on the front of each tool, as illustrated by Joel in his Prusa XL review on the 3D Printing Nerd channel. This was not indicated in the Prusa manual as an essential step. And in fact, I don't think Prusa themselves even knew that this was fully required until Joel presented them with his findings. I haven't gone back and looked, but I really hope they've added this to the manual so new users can avoid this issue altogether. Moving on, we have a 3-color print. And in fact, this was a 3-color print right next to a 2-color print. Again, we have some Z banding because that was still a persistent issue when this was printed. We have these two objects printing simultaneously, and we have a whole lot of tool changes to go back and forth between red and yellow and green, and then white and black. To do this on any other printer just wouldn't make sense. You would add so much purge, so much waste, and take way more time in order to print these simultaneously. It would make a heck of a lot more sense just to print them in series, one after the other. But then you'd have to start one print job, and then come back and start another print job at a later time. With the Prusa XL, you don't even have to think twice about printing these both at once. There's really no detriment to doing this, besides a few extra tool changes, but the amount of waste that you generate is very minimal, and the tool changes are really quick. So I really appreciate how on the Prusa XL, I can print everything I need for a particular model all at once without needing to break it up into separate print jobs. So we've looked at a few small multicolor models. How about we look at a large multicolor model? This bomb is printed in 3 different pieces, but they were all printed simultaneously as in the previous example. We also added in some PETG supports in order to support the underside of the fuse, and there's also some internal support required where this key enters the back of the bomb. As I mentioned prior, the success of PETG supports for a PLA print is very circumstantial. Sometimes it works great and other times not so much. In particular, it's fantastic for bridging, because in that case, the PETG is basically just giving you a surface onto which you can lay your material. So underneath the surface of this fuse, the quality was fantastic. However, internal to the model where the PETG was supposed to stick to the PLA, it just didn't work. So it's certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution for support material. In this print, I also experienced my first failure of the wipe tower. Because we were trying to mix PETG with PLA, two materials that don't stick, the wipe tower's structural integrity was compromised, and ultimately it did fail. In subsequent prints, I found a solution. You can force the wipe tower shell to be printed with a particular extruder, giving it some structural integrity, and then you just put the waste material internal to it. So in a reprint of this model, I forced it to use PETG for the wipe tower shell, and it was successful that time around. Alright, so we're getting a little more ambitious now. Next up, we have a 5-color tiki mask. I had intended for this to be a 6-color tiki mask, but things didn't go according to plan. I wanted the teeth to be white, and then replace that white with blue in order to use it later in the print. The active tool parked when it came to the M600 G code, but from the LCD I was only able to unload that tool and not any of the parked tools. The tool with white filament was parked, and there was no way I could change to that one in order to unload it. So ultimately I had to just resume the print and live with the fact that I wasn't going to have blue. When the print completed, there was a noticeable line where the filament change was intended to occur. Okay, have we had enough of PLA yet? Would you like to see something else? Me too. Here we have a dual material snail. We have PETG and TPU. It is quite a firm TPU at 98A, but it did print just fine. Loading it, however, was another story. It wanted to buckle at the filament sensor, and trying to push it through the PTFE was not very easy. Then when it got to the tool head, there was no way I could actually give enough pushing force to get it all the way into the extruder gears. So I had to remove the PTFE tube from the coupling and physically push the filament into the extruder. From that point forward, it printed just fine. The end result looked great. Our first successful multi-material print with the Prusa XL. Capitalizing on my early success with TPU, I decided to do another TPU PETG combination print. Here we have some flexible pliers. So this is a multi-material print using the properties of both filaments to their advantage. So we have the flexibility of TPU and the rigidness of PETG. This is a great example of something that is actually functional and practical. After a few cycles of gripping and releasing, I noticed that there was some separation at the interface between the TPU and the PETG. Fortunately, this was designed in such a way that there's actual physical interlocking of the materials and not just a chemical bond between the two surfaces. These materials stick together pretty well, but they don't stick as well as they do to themselves. So when combining materials, it's important to consider which materials work well and which don't. TPU and PETG is about the best combination you're going to find in terms of interlayer adhesion for different materials. But sometimes you actually don't want the materials to stick together. And that is true of our next example. This is a CT scan of a human spine. This is a 3-material print. We have PLA, TPU, and PETG. PETG for the support, PLA for the vertebrae, and TPU for the soft tissue in between. TPU and PLA do not stick to each other very well, which allows rotation about the joints at the interface between the vertebrae. Instead of a chemical bond between the materials, there's a mechanical interlocking. The designer has designed this in such a way that the TPU cannot be liberated from the PLA because it is stuck inside. There's quite a bit of stringing in this print because the TPU is not overly dry. I've also noticed that some of the vertebrae are on the verge of breaking off because the TPU portions were quite thin, and this was designed for a 0.4 nozzle instead of the 0.6 I printed it with. In the course of this print, there was a filament runout on the PETG that I was using for the support material. The filament runout procedure went off without a hitch. We unloaded, we reloaded, and we were back up and running. However, there is a noticeable shift in the print where that filament change occurred. This is the same phenomena that occurred on the Tiki mask earlier. So far, anytime we have filament runout on the XL, yes, it is recoverable, but there will be a noticeable print artifact left over as a result. In the process of printing this model, I also encountered a tool changing issue. Tool 2 didn't dock properly, requiring manual intervention to reseat it. The printer caught this error and paused for the user. Upon resuming, it tried to pick up the tool again and crashed. It then rehomed and tried again, at which point it was successful. I'm not sure what caused this to occur, but it was recoverable. And the printer's error handling did a great job of getting us back on track. Next up, we have an articulated wrist. This was also derived from a CT scan. The model is very similar. It's made of PLA, and you have TPU throughout, providing that flexibility. Instead of using PETG support for this model, I used PLA support with a soluble support interface. In the process of dissolving the supports, we had an unintended amputation. One of the fingers fell off. This is again a result of the TPU joints being a little bit fragile, perhaps because of the wetness of the TPU when printing, and perhaps because this model was designed for a smaller nozzle than the one I used. But overall, it's another great example of mixing materials and how efficient the Prusa XL can be at doing that. Moving right along and continuing the theme of soluble supports, we have a soluble support torture test. We have a PLA shell with a ball of ABS inside. I never thought I'd see the day where we mixed PLA and ABS in the same print, but here we are. For the soluble support, I used PVAS. You're probably familiar with regular PVA, polyvinyl alcohol. It's what most people think of when they think of soluble supports. There are a few others like BVOH or PVOH, but in this case, PVAS is an offshoot of regular PVA. It has a styrene component, which makes it more compatible with ABS. So it sticks a little bit better and gives more success in that scenario. However, it doesn't stick quite as well to PLA. So I had a lot of debris around the print as a result because there wasn't a great amount of adhesion between the PLA cube and the soluble support material. The end result turned out really well, and it's definitely a great example of how you can use soluble supports to print geometries that otherwise just wouldn't be possible. If you do want to use soluble supports, you really need a dedicated nozzle. If you were to run it through the same nozzle, you would have contamination, which would cause the print to break down as soon as it hit the water. So you really can only do this on a tool changing setup or an IDEX printer. The next model is kind of a fun one, and you may disagree with its place in this progression, but there's something about it that I think is just kind of impressive. This is an articulating possum from Matt Meyer Makes. I thought this would be a good test for the XL because there are some tolerances that are required for the articulation There's quite a few individual components that all need to have good adhesion to the bed, and we also have 4 colors that are present in every single layer of the model. Overall, it turned out really, really well, but there were a few pitfalls along the way in getting to this nice looking model. So on the first attempt, I had poor adhesion on one portion of the model, specifically the tail. And this has been a theme throughout my printing on the XL. The always perfect first layer is in fact rarely perfect. Oftentimes there are high spots, very rarely are there low spots, but whenever there are these high spots, usually you lose adhesion, resulting in a failed print. But in this case, it did give me an opportunity to try a new feature, that being cancel object. So I went to the LCD, clicked cancel object, and selected the tail. From that point forward, the printer never returned to that portion of the print, and it just resumed printing all of the other portions as if the tail never even existed in the first place. So in that regard, it was successful. However, when I came back the next morning, the print was paused. I could tell something had gone wrong just by looking at it. When I looked at the LCD, it said heater timeout due to inactivity. Normally, this means that the printer has cooled the nozzle, and you can click the button and heat it up again and go on your merry way. In this case, in addition to turning the nozzle heat off, it also turned the bed heat off, causing the print to detach. So when I went to resume it, there was no chance of recovery. And even after resuming the print, the bed didn't even attempt to heat up again. So this is definitely a firmware level issue that needs to be resolved, because this print might have been salvageable had the bed heat not turned off. In the process of transitioning from my first failed attempt to my second attempt, I also decided to switch out the textured PEI sheet for the satin sheet, which tends to work better with PLA. I also added a heck of a lot of glue stick just as an insurance policy. I really didn't think I would need glue stick on this printer, but as I said, the first layer is regularly consistent, and I'd rather use a little bit of glue than have a failed print. The adhesion was good this time around. At some point during this second print, I ran out of the gray PLA I was using for the body of the possum. This prompted the printer to pause and wait for manual intervention. This was another scenario where I wasn't near the printer and it hit that 30-minute timeout limit. When I came back, the nozzle was cool, but fortunately the bed was still hot, allowing me to recover the print. And the print ultimately went on to succeed, albeit with a small layer shift where that filament change occurred, just as we've seen on the previous examples. And last but not least, the one you've all been waiting for. Are you ready? Should I do it? Okay, here we go. Well, that was anticlimactic. Let's try again. There you have it, the Prusa tire. This is the most ambitious print of all. It combines multiple materials and multiple different colors. It uses PLA for support, 2 colors of PETG, and 2 colors of TPU. Unfortunately, the results didn't turn out quite as intended. This model was only supplied as G-code. Yeah, no 3MF, no STL, nothing. So I was forced to print this as intended by the original designer. And while this is a fantastic model, the sliced settings left a little something to be desired. The primary issue with this print is that the PLA support for the PETG just didn't work as intended. As we've seen through some of these other examples, it's very situationally dependent whether that combination is going to work. And in my case, it didn't. It seems to me that it must be brand dependent. Perhaps Prusa PLA and Prusa PETG stick well enough to make this possible, but my bargain brand PLA and my bargain brand PETG don't like each other, and this just didn't work. So when it came to printing the orange hub on top of the PLA supports, it only got a few layers down before it detached. Fortunately, I came into the room at just the right time, and I was able to intervene. I put some sticky tack on the hub and stuck it back down to the supports. I then waited nervously to see what would happen. The next few layers went down okay, but then the hub started to shift as it was getting pushed around by the nozzle. I knew once the gray spokes were connected to the outer rim that would add stability and it would likely complete successfully from that point forward. But between now and then, there was nothing I could do but wait and see what happened. Fortunately, it did make this transition okay, from which point the print did complete somewhat successfully. The end result doesn't look spectacular. A big part of that was because of the failure of the supports, but there's also some other slice settings that I would have changed if I could have done it myself. The infill percentage was quite low, which conserved time and material, but there's some pillowing on the top layer that just negates from the overall aesthetic of the tire. But by and large, it is still a very impressive showing from the Prusa XL. It handled its job with ease. Thousands of tool changes over multiple days, went off without a hitch. Unfortunately, I just had to live with the settings as they were, and as they weren't quite adequate. But ultimately, it's still a pretty cool print that shows off the capabilities of this printer. So there you have it. 13 examples of what the Prusa XL can do. I'd love to know in the comments down below which of these you think is most impressive. So here are a few of my takeaways after having done all of this testing with this printer. The perfect first layer is rarely perfect. I needed to use glue stick far more often than I would have anticipated. I'm not sure if it's an issue with the nozzle probing or something in firmware, but I'd really like to see this resolved to the point of getting what was advertised, which isn't always perfect first layer. While I did have a variety of issues over the course of these prints, the Prusa XL is quite good at handling those issues when they do occur. Generally, it will provide some helpful guidance on the LCD, and most of the time the errors are recoverable. I would like to see some of the bugs fixed, like the bed heater timing out after 30 minutes and layer shifts anytime a filament change occurs. One thing I quickly learned working with the Prusa XL is that it's like a sports car. You don't put cheap gas in it. You need high octane fuel. In other words, you need good quality filament, and it needs to be dry. If you have wet filament, or if you have brittle filament, the Prusa XL will make you suffer. Wet filament will create lots of stringing, especially with the 0.6mm nozzles. And even slightly brittle filament will be sure to break at some point in the very long PTFE tubes. The prime tower is a big point of failure. This can occur because of poor bed adhesion, or because you're trying to mix two materials that just don't stick well enough to one another. In that case, you can enhance the stability by enforcing that a particular extruder print the outer shell of the tower. You also have the option of just not using the prime tower whatsoever. I experimented with this and had a moderate degree of success, but I did notice that the seams were way worse when I wasn't priming between tool changes. I think this can be refined with some settings changes because I have heard of people printing without a prime tower and getting great results, but I haven't looked into this too much further. My biggest takeaway from testing the Prusa XL is just how efficient it really is. When it comes to multi-material, there's really no comparison. The closest would be an IDEX printer, but in that case you only have 2 materials and not 5. When it comes to multicolor, it really is night and day, the amount of time it takes and the amount of waste that is generated on the Prusa XL versus any other multicolor solution. It'll definitely be my go-to whenever I want to print anything multicolor and do so efficiently. So the Prusa XL had a rocky start, but it's trending in the right direction. It's getting more reliable and more consistent with every firmware update, and the print quality has increased across the board. I really enjoy having this printer in my arsenal. It opens up a whole new world of possibilities for different material combinations, different big multicolor prints, and all sorts of weird and wonderful things that I can do now that I just never would have attempted before. Most of these things wouldn't even have existed if not for the Prusa XL. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a like and hit that subscribe button. And let me know in the comments, did this convince you that the Prusa XL is worth the money, or do you still think it's overhyped? My name's Taylor, this is YGK3D, and until next time, happy 3D printing.